I'm very honoured to speak to the Cape Town libertarians, and for those who've come from very far, I think the furthest is Yuri, all the way from Wisconsin, so it's always great to see all of you. I've met some new people, and even last night we've had some great time. So also thank you very much to AfriForum for arranging and actually inviting me to speak. I'm a supporter of AfriForum, and I think they do wonderful work. Although I'm not speaking on behalf of AfriForum, I think I would like to, I was invited to analyze and give an economic perspective on what AfriForum does, and I find it very interesting, I find it fascinating, and I think libertarians and anarchists and people of minded of liberty would also find it fascinating. So I want to share with you a perspective on AfriForum from some of the ideas I think we share and from the framework we share. Now just a little bit on my background. I know AfriForum fairly well. I've been with the Solidarity Movement, and that's an association of organizations including Solidarity, the trade union, and AfriForum, and Helping Hand, a private charity, and various other organizations since about 2011. So I'm fairly involved, and I have a sort of good understanding what it's all about. And I think that while I'm going to speak about AfriForum specifically this morning, I think the whole Solidarity Movement more or less is aligned with this description that I want to give. Now, so my purpose this morning would be to show that when groups understand themselves to be effectively shut out from the state, then they have to use their imagination. And that's why I speak about voluntary by necessity. And I say AfriForum is an alternative approach to economic reform, because it's almost like they're accidental anarchists. They don't have any other choice because they're effectively shut out from thinking it's realistic to have a shot at, let's say, parliament or a shot at national power. And I think that's a very handy thing to make one use one's imagination. So it'll be about AfriForum as an organization, as a club. And I'll speak a little bit about clubs and the theory of clubs this morning, that bundles some services with an appeal to a perfectly normal cultural network, an existing one. And I think that that is a model for reform when the state is, and that will be my point of departure this morning, the state is incapable of real reform for the foreseeable future. Then such an impetus as the one AfriForum acts on, and the form of organization, the club, the theory of clubs, provides a healthy alternative to economic reform. Now, with economic reform, I could make it even broader. I could say social reform. So it will not be strict markets or commercial enterprise this morning. It will be economic in a more general sense. So before I get into AfriForum specifically, and I'm also going to give some context to AfriForum as a cultural network, because you have to understand where this cultural group, mostly Afrikaners, AfriForum's membership is something like, I think, 80% Afrikaans speaking. Why do they, did it come that they could band together in this way? So I'll contextualize a little bit of the history. I'm also going to speak and refer to a very, very interesting book. It's called Private Governance. It's by Edward Stringham. He's an economist at I think Trinity College. He used to be at Trinity College in the US, and he's recently accepted an appointment as head of the American Enterprise Institute, or some sort of organization, some similar organization in the US. But a very, very good book. He's written other books as well on the theme of anarchy and law and voluntary order mechanisms. So his book, Private Governance, is about order in economic and social life without reverting to force. And he gives some compelling examples. He refers to, and other people like Oliver Williamson and others refer to, what they call legal centralists. And those are people that believe that the governments are the chief sources of rules and enforcement rules. So legal centralist is someone who believes that order originates from government. Now, if order originates from government in South Africa, then the future looks fairly bleak, to put it lightly. More accurately, and most of us are here today because we share, at least to some degree, the feeling that government might be a source of disorder rather than a source of order. And now, so we have a fairly unsatisfactory state or governmental environment in South Africa, and most people are not very confident that things will change around. Even members in the ANC, even Jeremy Cronin recently spoke about how about the possibility of a Zimbabwe scenario. Now, if even Jeremy Cronin speaks about that, and Subius Makaiser echoed it, then I think it's fairly. I mean, I can't speak anymore about South Africa possibly becoming a Zimbabwe. It's just too mainstream. So that's how unsatisfactory government and the state arrangement in South Africa has become. And so for if those people are almost giving up hope, then well, I think if we turn our face, set our sights elsewhere, then we can be hopeful. And now Afrikaners, and this is where AfriForum comes in. This group also has some extra dimensions to feel uncomfortable with the current political arrangement. And I'll give some examples later on. But let's for now just state this as a point of departure, that Afrikaners specifically, unlike in the earlier, a few decades ago, it's very unlikely that Afrikaners will be able to exert themselves, minority as they are, to arrange the political and the public sphere in a way that suits them and that makes them comfortable with names and and cultural arrangements in schools and universities. So I'll expand on that later on, but Afrikaners have an additional reason to feel uncomfortable, and that at least is the reason, one of the reasons for AfriForum's existence. So we can add to the unsatisfactory state environment the cultural and political hostility felt by some people, and they have then banded in this instance as in the form of AfriForum. Now, the literature and theory on voluntary organizations, clubs, is expansive, and Stringham is a very good starting point. But you can look at many others, Williamson, Hasnas, Buchanan, many of them, Friedman, many of them give examples, historical examples of voluntary arrangements and variations on the theme of clubs as an alternative order mechanism. Not all of them are as optimistic as Stringham that you can replace completely governmental order by force with the use of the theory of clubs, but all of them make convincing cases of some measure. I'm sympathetic to Stringham's point that you can do basically all of it better voluntarily. Now, I'm going to quote a part from Stringham on private governance in contrast to legal centralism, because this is a key to being hopeful in South Africa. And I see AfriForum as an organization that gives hope for more order rather than less. So he says, the approach to private governance stands in contrast to what Williamson and others, this is Oliver Williamson, labeled legal centralism, the idea that order in the world depends on and is attributable to government law. Legal centralism, and all of us would have come across this, is widely held by among lawyers, lawmakers, and even some free market thinkers who believe that the protection and enforcement of contracts through courts and civil law is the most crucial need of a peaceful society. And he's quoting Ayn Rand here. He says, without such protection, no civilization could be developed and maintained. So Stringham, interestingly, even critical of Rand, who thinks that you absolutely need a government for the essentials of order. So he says, well, yes, whether one likes it or not, whether one likes it or not, often government law enforcement is absent, too costly to use, or unknowledgeable about or uninterested in protecting property rights or contracts. And because government regulators, police and courts are, to put it in the nicest way possible, this is very tactful Stringham, imperfect, private parties have potentially important unmet needs. And such parties can either live with problems or attempt to solve them. You can either live with problems or you can attempt to solve them. And if you attempt to solve them, you have two options. You can use you can try and get to Parliament and use the normal way political parties do things, or you can use this theory of clubs. So what do they do? And this is, well, now Stringham says that people can rely on government or they can devise private solutions. In 2005, Oliver Williamson, I think this might have, his Eli lecture to the American Economic Association, he said, the economics of governance is an unfinished project whose time has come. So by necessity, and when I say voluntary by necessity, I think this is not need to be limited to an organization like AfriForum, but even us, it is an investigation and a project which time has come, that is to form clubs to solve problems. Now, Stringham's book, and often we find this in libertarian environments, is we like the market, we like commerce, we think it's virtuous to make money and to use that to good ends, or even just leave it in the capital structure as custodians of the capital structure. And Stringham's book is focuses much, and much of the theory, Friedman and others would often focus on the commercial side of enterprises and clubs. And this is where AfriForum is interesting, and this is a bit of a gap, as far as I know, in the literature from the libertarian side on organizing not so much on profit basis, but on a non-profit basis. And they're bundling things where nobody seems to wants to make a profit. So, so I want to, and I think by this talk today might add a little bit to that side of the solution. So I think what we've seen so far is you can have government solutions and you can have private solutions. You can have private solutions commercially and you can have it non-commercially. But now, how would you have it non-commercially? Something has to exist prior to the club for the reason for the club to exist. So people have to share something in common, otherwise a club can't exist. It can be some very specific product need, or it can be something very natural, like a cultural community. And this is the case with AfriForum, a cultural community, and it exists irrespective of whether they have been organizationally formalized as a club. So Afrikaners exist whether they were clubs or not, and many other cultural communities across the world have and always will exist, irrespective of they have formal institutions. So the very reason AfriForum can exist is because common bonds precede the club. So common bonds precede the club. Now, so focusing on clubs and speaking about club goods, clubs allow members to opt into preferred governance structures. So when AfriForum then organizes based on the preceding common bonds, and they formalize their arrangements, they basically form a club. That is an opt-in arrangement, and they create incentives for cooperation within, and they create a mechanism for cooperation with other clubs and with other formal institutions, or formalized and organized institutions. And one of the most fundamental differences between public governments and private clubs is that private clubs are voluntary organizations that people join voluntarily and are free to quit. So AfriForum's almost 200,000 members are sure to break that number before the end of the year, voluntarily contribute an amount every month to AfriForum, but they are free to quit at any time. Very much different to tax and that sort of stuff. At this point, people often say, but isn't this exclusionary? And the exclusion-inclusion debate comes up. And sure, it is exclusionary. But that is the very nature of life. It's exclusionary only in the very normal, everyday sense without which we cannot live. Kukatas, who is a libertarian philosopher and is quoted by Stringham, writes that the fundamental principle of a free society is freedom of association. Now, there's nothing aggressive in freedom of association, and its first corollary, he says, is the principle of dissociation. So based on common bonds or some common interests or shared interest, in some sense, people associate and dissociate without necessarily any aggression towards anybody else. It's a positive thing. And so, of course, exclusion does exist in AfriForum sense, but in the very same sense it exists anywhere else, in the Bridge Club or in a language group or in the United Nations, which also exclude some countries. There are always exclusion and inclusion. Banks do it, commercial, non-commercial enterprises. So only in the very normal sense is there exclusion and inclusion. In fact, you can view this as, and Stringham refers to this as a sorting mechanism. It sorts people who would otherwise be disorderly, sorted in, so it's a mechanism that attempts to achieve greater internal and external cooperation, a process to bring together people who are more likely to have certain common interests and are more likely to want to follow a common set of rules. Now, a very positive sort of arrangements. It's a sorting mechanism. You bond together people who are likely to want to follow a certain set of rules without enforcing those rules on anybody who does not want to follow those rules. And that makes external and internal cooperation possible. So AfriForum as a club, it's a non-commercial club, and also, and just like any other organization, it has costs and benefits to any action. Now often an organization like AfriForum, and it's the same with any political party in this sense, they have to pick their battles. And so often I've heard people say, but why doesn't AfriForum, if their principle is, let's say, minority rights, why don't they fight every so-and-so battle? Why don't they fight this battle or that battle, or dissociate from this person or that person, or denounce someone's, what anybody or one of their members said? And the reason there is, I've thought about this a lot, so I thought, well, if AfriForum is a principled organization, it should always disavow something that goes against their principles. Until I thought, well, why would I expect this of AfriForum when I don't expect this of a commercial enterprise? So this venue, for example, would have a security arrangement, but it can be much safer if we employ 50 security guards to patrol this facility every day. It would be even more secure if we employ 100 security guards. But the cost outweigh the benefits. And so just as in any commercial enterprise, a non-commercial private voluntary organization also has to pick its battles, and it has to weigh costs and benefits before it takes something on. Right, so that's a bit about the theory. Let's move on to describing AfriForum, give a bit of their history, speak about their mission. I'm going to quote from their mission statement, and then I would want to spend some time on some of their specific projects that'll fit with the theory that I've just described. And I also want to contextualize AfriForum. And actually, I think I'm going to start with contextualizing AfriForum. So I've said that AfriForum is mostly an Afrikaner organization. But where does this come from? AfriForum originated, they started in about 2006, and of course no members. And over the past 11 years, it's grown to 200,000 members. How did this amazing coordination occur? Well, of course, it has a history. And I want to identify 3 periods in history of South Africa and Afrikaner history specifically to contextualize AfriForum. The first one is the period pre-1948, when AfriForum, of course, didn't exist, but the National Party did. And but in the period before 1948, where were Afrikaners in South Africa? Well, they weren't politically in power. And we can go back, let's speak about the 100 years before 1948. In that period, many private schools, universities, cultural enterprises, organizations, charities were formed by voluntary contributions, mostly for voluntary contributions, often with state support, but mostly voluntary contributions from Afrikaners. So that's the origin of the University of Stellenbosch, many schools across the country, many other universities, many private charities, many of the old age homes today have their origin in the period before 1948, when Afrikaners were not in control. So an interesting social arrangement, if you look at that period, you see many organizations, you see many clubs, if you wish, that give effect to the common interests of that group. Then something interesting happens. Afrikaners realize they can seize power. They count the numbers and they know how democracy works, and you figure out, well, if you are a majority given who may vote in 1948, then you can win an election. And so the National Party is very successful in running an election, and due to how that was set up, D.F. Malan comes to power. And in the period after 1948, right up to 1990 or 1994, however you wish to see this, effectively you had Afrikaner control of the state. And something interesting happens. All these organizations and all these universities I mentioned, all these private charities, all these old age homes, all the cultural energy that allowed a flourishing community infrastructure to come to existence in the period before 1948 becomes nationalized. And it doesn't become nationalized there's very little resistance to the nationalization, because Afrikaners think themselves to being in control of the state just as an extension of their community life. And a crucial difference is missed, that the state is a fundamentally different enterprise to private enterprises. It's not, so we move away from the theory of clubs and we move to the theory of forcible organizations. And in the intervening period, I have this wonderful quote from Professor Piet le Roux. He was a rector at Stellenbosch University, and in the 1970s he made a speech there where he said, he talked about the relationship between the university and the state. Now remember, Stellenbosch University, which started in the mid-1800s, was originally formed by shareholders. So I've seen the original shareholder agreement. It was a private enterprise with shareholders, and of course they later on made the mistake of making themselves a public institution and not a private institution, and accepting government money and so on. But the original agreement was a shareholders agreement, and so here's Professor Piet le Roux, about 100 years after that original thing was signed, the original agreement, and he makes a speech before the alumni of the university, and he says, and on this great principle, and he's now referring to something I'll elaborate on. He says, in this great principle, there can be no exception. Now he did this in Afrikaans, I have to translate it on the fly, but he said that it comes down to the great principle being that the higher education of a country is something that resorts under the state and under the national legislation, and this great principle, to it there can be no exception. And so effectively this could be Blade and Zimande speaking in any time today. There are parts of that speech that could be pretty much just Blade and Zimande in Afrikaans. Now of course he's not Blade and Zimande. He's not. He was a conservative gentleman in a very good sense, as far as I can understand. I didn't know him, of course, personally, but he's done many things, very positive things. He was certainly not a self-proclaimed communist, as Mr. Nzimande would think of himself, and he was a good Christian, and so he would have been critical of the October Revolution, unlike Mr. Nzimande, but here they say the very same thing. And why is this possible? Why is someone like D.F. Malan, not like Piet le Roux, who has this interest in community, able to say this? Well, it's because he has substituted the theory of clubs for the theory of the state, of forcible organizations. And because it was not, unlike AfriForum today, necessary to be imaginative enough and creative enough to find a voluntary arrangement, he made the crucial error of effectively nationalizing, in that sense then, universities. And so the interesting thing today is when I look at universities, I'm critical, of course, of the ANC and especially former Afrikaans universities who now mostly English, and of course cannot contribute in a very important sense to the cultural vigor of the Afrikaner community. When I think and I look at this and I feel sad today, then I am sad. I'm a little bit angry about the people who did this today, but I realize that it has a history, and unfortunately it was Afrikaners who set the system up in a way that made it possible to lose all these organizations. So we have the pre-1948 period. You have to be imaginative. You have to convince people that you have a good idea. You have to have two people at least who think it's a good idea. To the post-1948 situation where the state assumes this role. And what happens? People forget. People forget that they are able to band voluntarily, to create an old age home, to create a cultural organization, to set up a university from their own pockets and from their own imagination. And once this was forgotten, we saw a period in the 90s, I look at the period between 1990 and let's say 2000 as a 10-year or even more period of absolute culture. It's a cultural desert. There is very, very little energy among Afrikaner people to do these sorts of things, these great things that gave universities, old age homes, and even commercial enterprises their life, because they've forgotten that it is a personal responsibility. So there's an interesting point here which I cannot elaborate on, I don't have the time, but that there is a very, very big danger here, that just the same problems that befell Afrikaners may befall those who have and understand themselves to have a chance at power today. So if you and cultural communities in South Africa today who think that they actually have an opportunity to mold the state and to give, to invigorate their community through the means of the state, will also firstly not have the opportunity to go through the pre-1948 period Afrikaners went through, but also it will not be imaginative solutions, and they will, like Afrikaners, forget. And the longer people are in the mode of thinking that you have to go to Parliament to do something good in your community, the longer it will take to forget that very misguided idea. Now, let's move to AfriForum specifically and analyze them or comment on them based or describe them based on some of the things I've said now. So AfriForum's history: in 2006 the organization was formed as part of the Solidarity movement, and its vision, and I quote from its website, it says that Afrikaners have no other home, that Afrikaners who have no other home are able to lead a meaningful and sustainable existence in peace with other communities here on the southernmost tip of Africa. It's a peaceful endeavor. It is it's an endeavor that necessarily means that they wish to contribute not only to themselves but also to the people and the communities around them. That's how you lead a meaningful and sustainable existence. And then it has various bundled services that goes with that. So, so the bundled services, let's elaborate on them. This enterprise called AfriForum, with its 200,000 members, provide political and cultural protection. And they do this where there is quotas in sport or in employment or in other places where their members are effectively excluded or hindered from participating in those arrangements. So I think you can call this political and cultural protection. That's one reason people belong to AfriForum, even though they won't get, maybe they themselves personally will get a benefit, but they think that it's important for their kin and their cultural community to be protected from this. So that would be things like quotas or name changes, and I'm not speaking about name changes in general here. AfriForum themselves support some name changes in the country of towns and streets and so on. But a cultural community anywhere in the world, for it to feel at home somewhere, for it to lead a meaningful existence, it has been all through history, cultural communities have contributed to, we can call them artifacts in the public sphere that makes it possible to feel at home, that makes it a recognizable environment, one you can navigate in, one you feel welcome and safe in, a safe space. If I may appropriate, is this cultural appropriation if I speak about safe spaces? Well, so AfriForum does this too, and as does anybody anywhere in the world. And so where possible, AfriForum either engages in public participation processes about name changes or changes on the cultural artifacts, or they actively contribute to filling public spaces with artifacts where appropriate to make their members feel more at home. They also provide political and cultural protection against incitement. And whether we may agree or not if it's good to take Varashni Pillay to court for hate speech or Julius Malema for incitement, from AfriForum's perspective and from its members' perspective, it's important when somebody is inciting violence and when it is being understood to incite violence, it is understandable that an organization would want to act on that and that members would want to contribute to those causes. Another instance of political and cultural protection is farm murders. And whether or not everything, and definitely not everything about farm murders are politically motivated, but a large number of Afrikaners find themselves on farms, and these horrific things that happen on those farms have an impact on the psyche of Afrikaner people. And so that explains why AfriForum is also involved. We're working with the police, or even sometimes criticizing the police for inaction or other things. But crime and in general and farm murders specifically make the members of AfriForum feel uncomfortable and not at home. So as a bundled service, here AfriForum again provides a sort of political and cultural protection. Legislation are passed every day and on many fronts that are either detrimental to enterprise in the country, and in that sense to AfriForum and everybody else, but also of a political and cultural nature that on free speech and other things. And so it makes sense that AfriForum again on legislation has a team and comments on public on these things and lobby against or for some legislation. Then finally, people always speak of cultural appropriation, but we can also speak of statist appropriation. And I've already traced this back to, in part, Professor Tom and Afrikaners themselves, who did a statist appropriation of cultural artifacts and institutions like universities and schools. But today, that statist appropriation, of course, continues with people like Panyaza Lesufi, the MEC in Gauteng for education, who wants to have a central database from which he basically will control where people will be able to go to school. Now, that's a statist appropriation of a fundamentally communal type of organization, like a school. Robert Nisbet, the conservative American sociologist, referred to these as intermediary institutions. Tocqueville and others, along with Nisbet and many, have commented on the importance of intermediary institutions in society, without which there cannot be peace and prosperity, because then, without that, only the state remains. The absolute state remains without intermediary institutions. And so it makes very much sense that AfriForum protects the institutions its members understand to be something that belongs to them. But it has a very good, what is called external benefit, something you can't, all the semi-free market people always say you have to stop the free market because you can't recover the costs of positive externalities. I want to speak about a positive externality. It's incredible, huh? The free market gives people stuff for free, and then people say that's a problem and we have to regulate the free market. Now, so in this sense, AfriForum also has a positive externality, in the sense that every battle it wins for the principle of intermediary institutions against the state is a win for cultural communities and for community in general in South Africa. So that's a very positive externality. Some alternative common undertakings, which maybe we don't want to put under the heading of protection or political and cultural protection, we can put sport. So AfriForum has some initiatives to give quota-free sport. It has security projects called, for example, Project Nehemia. It helps neighborhood watches. So that's people like you and me who patrol our neighborhoods in the evening. They institutionalize this and give them control rooms and training and so on to make sure that it's not a fly-by-night cowboy sort of setup, but that people have protection. With this, I'm not sure how far it goes, but I know they're looking into insurance in order to enable their members to be protected when they undertake action on behalf of their community. This security arrangements is another instance where I think there are positive externalities, and as it's also for me an example of how you can, by forming a club, it enables the members of the club to work positively with people from in another club. In this case, I want to refer to taxi associations as another club. And so some of AfriForum's neighborhood watches actively work together and patrol with taxi organizations. Two clubs working together, a very, very positive thing. Then, of course, we all know about the public services like municipalities filling potholes, firefighting, water quality testing, repairs of water pumps, and sometimes they even have what they call a month of self-reliance, which means you don't go to the municipality, to the government to ask to repair something in town, you just do it yourself. And a great initiative. Then we know about Gerry Nel, the advocate. So AfriForum has recently moved into the area of private prosecution, where potential criminals are identified but not prosecuted by the state. AfriForum now is setting up the infrastructure to be able to prosecute those people themselves. And then finally, so you have the cultural and the political protection, you have some alternative bundled services, and then you have co-branded and bundled commercial products, as one would expect of a membership tally of 200,000 of a club like that. So you can do vehicle tracking. So AfriForum brings down the costs of services to its members It's like vehicle tracking. There's a wristband for, you can have an emergency 911 for AfriForum members. I was hijacked last year. The first thing I called was not the police, but AfriForum. And I got straight to the nearest police station through that call center, and people were able to help me with that. So venues and holiday resorts, a GPS app, all sorts of commercial bundled products that come with this. So it brings down costs of products, it brings down transaction costs, and it improves a transaction cost internally, but also with the club and with other clubs. So transaction costs in an inter-club sense as well. That more or less is the picture I find when I look at AfriForum, and it excites me immensely because it's a voluntary organization. Nobody is forced to join it. AfriForum is unable to exert force against any other party, and it has no realistic chance of going to parliament and trying to take over the majority of seats. And all of those are very positive things that make for an organization that sometimes may be controversial, definitely, but it makes for an organization that can do very little harm, if any. In fact, if other people understand this to be a club, to be an institutionalization of common bonds, to be a peaceful and in a very important sense a humanist undertaking, then I think it is a very good grounds for other potential clubs and other existing clubs and any to emulate and as an order mechanism for South Africa. So when I see South Africa today, I'm concerned that increasing disorder, increasing what Bastiat would call disharmonization of interests are about to occur. And when I look at AfriForum and when I see other clubs, I see potential for order. They are accidental anarchists. They are voluntary by necessity. And that makes for an imaginative undertaking. What else are they to do than to have to imagine possibilities? Now, fortunately, none of this is unique. I've referred in this specific sense to a taxi club. But all around us, contrary to the legal centralists, the uni-legalists, the legal, contrary to what the legal centralists wants us to believe, order in general is only in the exception managed or maintained by the state. In general, order, the fact that we can go outside and meet and greet people and we aren't killed, that is a fact of the cultural energy of a community and of a society, and of the common bonds that exist and the overlapping authorities of various intermediate institutions like Nisbet would have named them and called them. That is what order is like, and the legal centrists want us to believe that they are to thank for that, but in fact often I think they are to thank for disorder. And therefore I'll conclude by saying there are all around us beauty, all around us potential for order if we open our eyes to it, and that AfriForum and similar organizations are mechanism for order where government is either unable to bring order or where it is in fact a source of disorder. Thank you.
Most sort of sit on the internet and just type a lot on Facebook. But what I wanted to ask was, on the topic of education in South Africa, if you could wave a magic wand, what laws or regulations would you get rid of? Because I'm just sort of not really aware of the kind of regulations that South African education has right now. I've always thought if we could have more private colleges, it would alleviate our problems a lot better. So what laws would you get rid of if you could just snap your fingers?
Well, you said it. So basically I'd get rid of the Education Act and let free enterprise take over and reputation and so on. So I have some experience with the Higher Education Act, which makes it virtually impossible. It's very, very difficult to set up private higher education in South Africa. Schools also heavily regulated, and it's not only legislation, it's also court findings, court orders, or what are they called? When the judge writes something, it's called a verdict. So the verdicts have been piling up against the the authority of the school governing body to maintain whatever arrangements in school they would like. And it is the verdicts itself, not only the legislation, but the verdicts have been moving the institutions under the domain of the state. Interestingly, in the early 90s, there was a period where many schools, the way I understand it is what we know as Model C schools today, or former Model C schools. There were other models, of course, as well, Model A's, B's and C's. And I understand that one of those models, and only very, very few schools in the country took up that model, was that you could go full private. And the Model C one was where you would effectively remain a government school, but the governing body would have some residual control. Which has been carved away in the past 20 years. But of course, without the cultural energy and having forgotten what happened pre-1948 and that a community is able to maintain its own schools, the courage, or I would just say courage, it was just unthinkable that schools could be privatized. So the opportunity was there, but it wasn't taken. So interesting. Temba.
Yeah, so in response to the question that you've asked,
Yes.
I have, sorry, if you don't mind me standing up, and that's because I'm missing this back problem that I have. So if you see me, performing any abnormal sort of movements, that is what explains it, the back problem. Now, what I want to say in response to your question that you were asking, what I've always advocated is that what we need to do in this country is to, now referring to the policymakers and legislators, is that we need to have a moratorium on the enactment of any policies, any legislation. Because most of the laws that are being passed have a negative impact on the socio-economic welfare of the people. The evidence is there for everybody to really comprehend this. And so if there is a moratorium on passing any legislation, then what should also occur at the same time is that there should be some kind of committee that would also involve private sector interests that would look at all legislation that has been passed and define some kind of litmus test as to which ones ought to be repealed altogether. And that litmus test might be in the form of the principle of a regulatory impact assessment. So all those laws will be critically evaluated and so on, and that brief should end there, that these laws should be scrapped altogether. And if the politicians were to buy into this, which is highly unlikely, I think maybe impossible, but if they were to buy into this, or even a new government that might crystallize after the 2019 elections were to embrace this idea, then I say we are on the right track. Then I say we are on the right track. So that's my not so brief answer to the point you were asking.
Piet, I just wanted to ask, so given this idea of the theory of clubs and the theory of the state around particularly education, so I mean, already the two comments have alluded to the idea of what can be done at a legislative level, at a state level, and in a way, what you're talking about is a little different to that, right? I mean, the sort of starting assumption, partly, and it's not to say that we can't try and achieve success at a national and a governmental level, but partly the starting assumption here is that we're not going to achieve success. And Temba has partly alluded to that by saying that it's very unlikely to be accepted, certainly by this present government. So what does for you education look like in a theory of clubs worldview? And do present national legislative barriers fundamentally hinder the ability for education to progress in a club worldview, and how do you get around that, and what does the future of that look like?
Yes, I think that the national legislation does hinder it a lot, but it doesn't make, it's not impossible to do stuff like, because as attested to by there being private schools. Many private schools are set up for profit, and so they've been making headlines, good share prices and so on. But education to me is, and I think to most people, is something that they generally like it more if it's a non-profit. So the question is, can we have non-profit educational enterprises that replaces what is being threatened by schools? So first, what I suspect will happen to most public schools in South Africa, especially those that have a good reputation, of which Afrikaans schools are a very big part. They are likely to be effectively nationalized increasingly. They are likely to become under a control on who has to go into the school, and effectively, if that is being done, so if Panyaza Lesufi or any minister decides how children should be distributed across country as if they are just salt you can spread, I mean that's the most disrespectful thing to do to children, to disregard what their parents and they want to do for school. So anyway, some ministers think that that is a proper way to treat other people, and they intend to do that. What they will effectively do, among other things, is they will make the schools not Afrikaans anymore, because it's impossible once a school, and the proportion of Afrikaans speaking people in the country is something like, let's say 10% for now, you effectively make the school English. So and we will see this. I think most of what is currently the former Model C schools will, over the next few years, given trends, be effectively nationalized and become at least English before that. And that will be a problem because much of these schools, the buildings still belong to the government, and so a little bit of the salaries are paid. But some of these schools have enough money in funds they're putting away, and increasingly these schools are, whenever they have a fundraiser, they don't set up or they don't build a new building on the school premises, they build it off-site in another NGO and another title, and the title isn't held by the school. So all across South Africa, not only Afrikaans schools, I think many of the most more well-off schools are getting into this sort of mechanism. That makes me optimistic. So they are spreading their risk by not putting everything in the school's name. And then we will see a migration, I think, of schools to new premises as the old premises gets either not Afrikaans anymore, or in other languages cases become a state-run institution. But that'll be expensive, but we have a look at schools and fundraisers and new funds are setting up. It's not in the name of the school, and it's elsewhere. So I think that's hopeful.
He seems like AfriForum has got its fingers in quite a lot of social pies. That's what it's describing. I mean, they're active in a lot of things. One of the things you said that they're also quite active in is security. Now, one thing I'd like to ask is to what extent do you ever see AfriForum possibly getting involved in the struggle for gun rights in South Africa? Specifically in the current situation, there's two main organizations, Subverts. So Subverts has been quite stagnant for a very long time. Those has only just started invigorating itself. Big court case on now going to the Constitutional Court for the constitutionality of provisions of the Firearms Control Act, which itself is a very highly arbitrary document drawn up without any input from gun associations, backboners drawn up because they were just so disorganized at the time. And then you've got SAPS, who is supposed to enforce the law, and now they've become actually an extension of Gun Free South Africa by themselves, by the way that they're trying to interpret the act and just go along with these things. It's quite extraordinary. So, yeah.
So I think I can't speak for AfriForum, but I know that they have some initiatives in this area. They've been very critical of police losing weapons. And they've brought out some reports in association with the South African Institute for Race Relations. I think it's something you could speak. It certainly fits with the general picture of being able to care for yourself.
One of the big problems that, say for example, goes to gun rights organizations like us are reluctant to do is ask for assistance from someone like AfriForum, because specifically at their membership base, I mean, the amount of EFF members that are in gun owners South Africa is quite, you can see why they're worried about stepping on toes or alienating them. So the reason I was asking is the likelihood of AfriForum picking up the baton and making a coordinated effort rather than, but yeah.
I just want to add a little bit. I mean, Ed Stringham, he's great, and just saw him at the Freedom Fest and whatnot. But the whole theory, I think, of this, you call it club theory, whatever, it's civil society ideas was developed first by Adam Ferguson, who was a way predecessor of Hayek. In a sense, he was a contemporary of Adam Smith. And Adam Ferguson, he was talking about spontaneous order. He was talking about that not by human design, by interaction of humans, we have this wonderful civil society, which he thought will crowd out the state completely. That you don't need state apparatus if you have well-developed civil society. And I think that AfriForum is a very good, it's an excellent kind of form of crowding out, because what the in a sense that the state is being crowded out by, for example, in Russia, mafia, organized crime. It was, why did it emerge? Because the state was not performing functions like, for example, protection of private property. So then you need private institutions, and these institutions can be kind of benevolent, benign, like say AfriForum, or can be organized crime or whatever else. And this is what Mary Rothbard called anarcho-tyranny. When the state is performing functions it should not perform, but it does not perform functions it should. And then you have this kind of the civil society institutions which would, and I think that it was very interesting insights into AfriForum. But I've heard that you also are interested in organizing kind of like a business activities around that. What would I think that would be very interesting if you can maybe tell us a little bit.
I can speculate a little bit. I will make an announcement in a few weeks. There's some other initiative that I'll be joining, so I can't go into too much detail, but it's not unrelated to AfriForum, which will, the idea will basically be to create a state-proof business network. So how can we provide the infrastructure that commercial enterprise needs to be able to do business in the absence of states providing some of those functions like dispute resolution, it's basically a trust network. How can you set up a trust network with various specific mechanisms that make commerce possible? And in two cases, one where it is actively being undermined by the state, or otherwise where it isn't properly, where it isn't catered for. Now, of course, not everything, I'm critical of the state, but not everything the state or an organization does is bad. There are good things. I think all of it can be done better voluntarily, but not necessarily everything that is done by force is bad, but there's an ethical problem with it, but in itself not necessarily bad. So this initiatives that I hope to be a part of will be how can you create the infrastructure that makes commerce possible in the absence of or in spite of the state.
So I just wanted to ask, I know AfriForum, they're doing most academia, which is the private higher education. Is AfriForum going to, we're also going to do sort of lower elite high schools and so on? And then there's this thing of the schools moving their sort of assets to a different title. You know, what is stopping the state? Because once there is, a even more mass migration from the public school system to a private school system, you know, what stops the state from just going, oh well, and then signing a document that says, we're nationalizing this. Yeah.
And nothing except the same thing that stops the state from taking your jacket, because it's another step against the tide. There's always in civil society there's a string, and the state can't pull the string too far, then it breaks. So hopefully you're on the good side of the string once it's in a new title and so something. But it's always possible. But that's the general risk we have. You asked about academia. So I'm currently involved with academia. I'm as the academic head of academia, and it's been wonderful the support we've had from organizations like AfriForum, Solidarity, and many other organizations. We're an NGO on our own with our own board, and so we're our own organization, but we are part of the Solidarity movement. And the idea is, in this case, to eventually end up with a university that basically is true to some of the classical ideals of what it means to be a university, and more specifically to bring these fruits of cultural and educational pursuit to Afrikaans-speaking people. So I always say academia is something where we want to have people who are standing 1 feet in their community and 1 feet in the world, and the university is sort of a bridge that brings the part to the whole, and the whole in harmony with the part.
You mentioned that you guys work with the tax association, and I'm just wondering what interest you guys have in there.
I don't work. I'm a member of AfriForum, and I'm very interested in AfriForum. I'm trying to take an outside look on AfriForum, so I don't have any details on how that works. That's some operational. But I know I can't even remember the town. But there's a formal agreement in some of these places between some taxi organisations and the local neighbourhood watch, and they have agreements on mutual collaboration. I don't know exactly how it's set up, but I've heard it explained to me, and it sounded absolutely great. So I think my time is basically up. Yeah.
One more question.
Okay.
I'd just like to ask one thing very quickly. At present, what can a qualification from academia get you? What kind of recognition is there for it?
Well, it has the very same recognition any other degree in the country has. So it's gone through all the same hoops as UCT or Stellenbosch or Rhodes and so on, and it has that exact same. Now the problem is it's also gone through the same hoops as some of the lesser prestigious universities in the country. So it's a very low bar. In that sense, we certainly consider, and as I think any proper university should, government accreditation as a minimum. And we certainly strive to more. So it gets you a good education that we're constantly improving, and it also gets you, in a very specific sense, if you're interested in economics, you'll get a good dose of exposure to Austrian economics at academia. Not legal centrism. You'll get a legal pluralist view as well from our. We have a law degree, for example, as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.